very large. At the same time, this was a very uneven growth. Between 1885 and 1910, the Muslim share of Sarajevo's population decreased from 60% to 36%, while the Catholic share, unsurprisingly, decreased from 30 to 35%, so making these two groups almost the same size. Also, perhaps it should be emphasized that this contrasted with the situation in Bosnia as a whole, where the shares of the different confessional groups did not change significantly during Habsburg rule. Thus, in Sarajevo, a process of de-Ottomanization took place, specifically in terms of the evaporation of the traditional Muslim demographic predominance. The historian Hamdija Krševijaković once famously stated that more German could be heard on the streets of Sarajevo under Habsburg rule than Turkish under Ottoman rule, and indeed this seems to be the case. By 1910, only 70% of the city's inhabitants declared Serbo-Croatian to be their mother tongue, and the second most common tongue was already German, spoken by 10% of the population as a mother tongue. I'm sure it was spoken as a sort of lingua franca among many of the expatriate, of the smaller expatriate communities like Czech, Hungarian, Slovene, and Polish are more numerous. They amount to around 90% of the population, but 9% of the population also spoke another indigenous language to Sarajevo that is called in the statistics, which I suppose you can hardly see, what's called Spaniolski, Latino. And I found it quite astonishing that only 31 people in 1910 declared Turkish as their mother tongue. And it probably shows us, it tells us something about the extent to which this language was outmoded at the time. At the same time, before I move to the monuments, the grave differences within the various linguistic confessional groups should not be glossed over. For example, within the Muslim community, there was a division between those willing to collaborate with the new power holders and those who opposed them outright. The historian Harun agreed to point out that this division more or less parallels that between those who supported reforms already during the Ottoman period and those who did not. But in the northern regions, especially, there was also a kind of new elite of Muslim entrepreneurs who were unconnected to the traditional elites of big families and ulema, and they appear to have had a more amicable relationship with the authorities as long as their businesses thrive. So in what follows, I will walk us through a number of notable projects from the period of Habsburg rule, and assuming a broad familiarity with some of them. For this audience, I will focus on the what I think would be the lead research project. And there is one project that I have described in the book as a sort of catalyst for the development of this oriented style. It did not concern a new construction, but rather a renovation of Sarajevo's paramount work of Islamic architecture, the Begovo Mosque, which was affected by the Bashtalsha fire of 1879. It's a bit unclear if the damage may not have been rather superficial, but probably the authorities did not want a shabby-looking old mosque to symbolize what was advertised abroad as a successfully ongoing modernization. So after some confusion concerning responsibilities, the mosque was closed for a whole half year, second half of 1885, and the interior with almost 3,000 square meters of surface were painted. And this was a lot, so if you calculate it down to the work days, it means that around 30 square meters of space had to be decorated every day. And of course, this was only possible with somewhat repetitive patterning and the use of stencils, obviously not by freehand fresco painting. And there was a public bid for this paint job. It was won by a company from Slavonski Brod, and they executed a decorative scheme that had been previously designed by an architect and scenographer called Hans Niemeczek, whom rather little is known. And reportedly, photographs taken in the Alhambra were used, obviously patented from the Alhambra. And perhaps it should be emphasized that the previous late Ottoman decoration was completely restored, as it was found too simple and too naive for a monument of this stature. So the goal was to monumentalize this building through decoration that befitted. Around the millennium, the interiors after period features were covered up with as you can see here, a fully automated coating. In the portico, where Limacek may have imitated portals of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, here you see them to the right. These have already been simplified in the 1930s, and the rest disappeared with the interior, except for the painting on the colossal portal frame, which we see here to the right. So that's the last remains of this Habsburg period decoration phase. Yes. But the oldest existing building designed in the Orientalizing style, the oldest new building was this one. It was built as the School of Islamic Law, Shariatsrichterschule, it was called in its day. It was called by a young Czech architect called Karl Pažik for a school, the purpose of which was to educate public servants. So this was who would preside over family law cases involving Muslims. It also has been called the Qadi Schule, but it was called the Sharia Schule. The researchers revealed that the construction took place in two phases. First, the boarding track in the back was erected in 1887, and it was followed by the frontal track with the main entrance in 1888. Perhaps I should also emphasize the well-preserved decorative painting in the arcaded courtyard, which again was completed by, according to designs by Hans Limacek in 1889. And the research also revealed, and there will be another book specifically about this school building at the end of the year, I hope, bilingual, some changes that occurred during the planning process. So initially we see a mosque was planned to be located above the entrance and surmounted by a dome, but then for some reason that I haven't really understood, it was decided to move the mosque and with it the dome to the courtyard. And the upper floor was reprogrammed for a conference hall and remains so until today. I mean, today's the dean's office. The portal section's pointed colossal arch was replaced with a horseshoe-shaped arch, also in this process of replanning, possibly to make the building resemble a parallel construction at the time that also had this feature, the Muslim reading hall or Qira'at-Khana by the architect Josip Wansa. So maybe this was part of an like the definition of a style for a sort of corporate identity, featuring both the horseshoe-shaped arches, importance and window shapes, as well as this horizontal banding. Yeah, and there was also one problem with the mosque that was to be located in the Shariatsrichterschule. Of course, many of you know that the mosque is oriented towards Mecca, but the building is on an east-west orientation. So a rather clever solution was found. The mosque space was formatted as an octagon. So you can see here where's the prayer niche. Should be here. The prayer niche could be facing the southeast. So the praying actually in this room is done in this direction. But then we also discovered there was one more source that showed a change in the execution. The round dome was turned into an ellipsoid dome, probably to make the orientation of the display space even more correct, because maybe the southeast octagon was not. This was this was followed by, so this is the decorative program on the inside of the mosque and the arcaded courtyard. It's the most extensive preserved decorative program in this style, other than the VH itself. So projects like the Sarajevo Sept were then followed by experiments in applying this orientalizing style to multi-story buildings in the city center. And one well-preserved example dating from 1889 now houses the Hotel Central. It was not actually built as a hotel, it was built as a coffee house with two very large flats on the upper floors. Evidently this did not work, it was turned into a hotel, converted into a hotel rather soon, and it retained the name Ayas Pashin Dwar of the Vakuf, of the land that it took over. And about the same time, the same architect Vansash was also commissioned to rebuild the Isabegov Hammam on the opposite side of the Miletska River. And looking at the original plans, I found it quite curious, and it hasn't been really stressed enough. I think that this was both a traditional bath, hammam, and a modern tub bath with different functions on in different parts of the building. And so this building with the trilingual inscription initially, maybe you can see it here, was inaugurated in 1891. In Pashchashia, Vansash was also hired to propose a design for the wholesale reconstruction of economic structures associated with the Husrev-Begov Vakuf, the Bezistan and the Tashnihan, both of which date back to the 16th century, so maybe it's good that this project wasn't realized, but it's still quite interesting. The one to the right was implemented in 1897, again by foreign design by Nemecek. It's called Tulagin War, and it's a quite invasive, perhaps you won't say it's the most invasive injection into this old fabric. It's an L-shaped unit that has facades on both the historic footwear of the Bashashia and the train railroad. The Tulagin War overlooks the courtyard of the Begova Mosque, which bears traces of three more interventions from the 1890s. Firstly, there is the historic founders mausoleum located next to the mosque, and it was quite by chance that in an old sales catalog of a Hungarian ceramics factory, the Zsolnay factory in Pécs, I found a specimen of the tile that has been used to clad the interior of this mausoleum, and that's actually a preserved specimen in Pécs in the museum. So this was this intervention I talked about around 1893. It was decided that a part of the mausoleum's interior would be clad in tiles. Obviously recurring, references in Ottoman practice, but in this case, since the tile has been recorded, it should be established that this was the design was based on the 16th century Ottoman tile from Jerusalem that the son of the factory owner bought on a trip there, and then it was probably given to the two daughters of the factory owner, Julia and Therese, who made the designs for the Zsolnay, or for many of these Zsolnay tiles. Yes, and in the same year, the mosque's Lucian fountain was renovated, and as far as I could tell, the late Ottoman wooden canopy was first documented in great detail, and then apparently recreated with minimal alterations. But the old stone basin that we also see here was completely replaced. It was not found befitting. It was replaced with one made with marble from Prague that is supposedly modeled on an Ottoman ablution fountain in Bursa, but this is a claim I couldn't really verify thus far. And basic are wiring, supposedly, as many of you know, it's supposed to have been the world's first electrically lit mosque in 1898. Which is a novelty that was obviously soon forgotten once it became a standard. But the single iron candelabrum affixed to the porch appears to be the most visible material trace of this historical event, which in its day was really a spectacle as far as I can tell. The whole Pashchashia was lit with lights from the minaret. But it was also very expensive, so it was agreed that only for very festive occasions this kind of festive lighting would be used. A much more visible addition to the heart of Ottoman Sarajevo was the Sebil, a public fountain built in 1891 to replace an Ottoman Sebil. So our Sebil is not really a Sebil, it's a fountain. Alexander Wittek's design for this elegant micro-architecture was traditionally said to have originated in Istanbul, where quite similar objects can be identified if you compare them formally, but these are practically always used in marble. I don't know of form usually of marble, never of wood. And so in the book I present an alternative thesis that a vitrine, an exhibition vitrine in the Egyptian pavilion of the 1873 Vienna World Fair may have inspired the Sarajevo Sept, which is really so this is something very likely fitted to the exhibition or at a museum that is in Vienna for a time. It was called the Oriental Museum. It was supposed to advance trade with the Orient and many objects and also Wittek's successful essay may have qualified him for the nomination to design the first project for the Sarajevo Vijećnica. There was a first proposal by artist that not the governor's approval, and as the available documentation may have been insufficient for such a significant undertaking, Wittek was sent to Cairo twice to produce detailed drawings of major Islamic monuments there, and with the help of these, this earlier plan was to be restyled. Apparently, so there was a significant decision around 1891 that not only Muslim or buildings or people buildings related to the Muslim community, but also public buildings in Bosnia more generally should and could be designed in such a style. But as many of you know, the story that Wittek soon fell ill upon his return, which is why another architect, Ivekovic, was entrusted with completing the project. And I think Ivekovic's love of Venetian architecture is quite evident in the river-facing facade here, which assimilates Cairene and Andalusian forms into the facade grid of a late Gothic palazzo, really, on the Grand Canal. Ivekovic worked tirelessly, but as he was not standardly credited as the work's author, he suddenly turned his back on Sarajevo and never returned. He went to Zadar, actually, angrily. But Wittek's drawings must have remained in the construction department's drawers, where they would have been available for other government projects. I believe possibly for the railway station abroad, and perhaps also for Visokos town hall, which is a bit more experimental than its counterparts. There's other buildings that were clearly influenced by the Vijećnica, the Kubuino, and also the gymnasium in Mostar. But this constitutes already a second wave of buildings in this, or projects in this Orientalizing style. And the style basically died with the Governor Kallai in 1903, whose Bosnian policies were closely related to this style, and perhaps his death also made it easier to publicly criticize it as whatever foreign, misguided, or in one case even as paralyzing. And if you look at some of these interiors, especially, it's not entirely easy to disagree sometimes. The last major project in Sarajevo in this style was also completed around that year, 1903. It was on the regulated Miljacka bank that the widow and son of the former mayor of Sarajevo, Mustafa Fatih, had a residence built according to plans by the architect Ludwig Huber. So the Fatih were one of the old Muslim families of Bosnia whose power and land holdings even increased in this period. So there's a couple of such cases during last year, and I think in a sense the architecture of the residence reflects their position in this new system. Also, it takes the form of a modern villa. A male-female separation is retained in its bipartition into a haremlik and a zenandut. Its extroverted position on the waterfront was also quite unusual. Massive walls were switched for an iron fence, and I believe that the narrowness of the windows, of which we see the part here, may have been intended as a compromise with the goal to safeguarding some kind of privacy, despite this exposure on the waterfront. Finally, let us move upstream to see what replaced the Orientalist fantasies of the 1890s. So this is really a style that peaks in this period. In 1910 and 1911, the Sarajevo Jamia was extended to embrace the chancellery of the ulema majlis. The old complex thus gained a riverbank facade on the elevated Middlesbrough, and it's quite interesting that this extension towards the 16th century Ottoman style mosque was so seamless that it has been difficult for some, including architects, to determine where the old ends and the new begins. And of course, project in this style has been growing to Islamic style in favor of a local variation on which, and it also seems to illustrate a newfound confidence in using Ottoman forms after the peaceful resolution of the annexation crisis in 1908. To conclude my presentation, I would like to reflect on the value of some of these architectural works in shaping Sarajevo's self-image and perhaps also its tourist appeal. Of course, many of the Sarajevo works are already part of the tourist trail and of popular visual and they are popular visual souvenirs. Selfies I'm referring to, such as the Viečice or the Sibyl especially, but also the Šatrvan that I've shown and the painted portal and the tiled mausoleum are part of the Begova complex experience. The Ulema Majlis and the Isabego Hammam are part of the waterfront or of panorama of left bank Sarajevo, and along with the Ayas Pashin's War, the Julagin War, and the Fatih Pashic Villa can at least be viewed from the outside. And also, of course, it's not a museum, but the School of Islamic Law, currently the Faculty of Islamic Studies of the University of Sarajevo, is occasionally visited, can be visited occasionally, and also, as I've heard, the now vacated Ulema Majlis seems to be considered as for a potential museum of Islamic culture in Bosnia. Of course, given its central location and the added value of being able to see this historic structure and its preserved decorations and wooden fittings from the inside. Now, how should one approach the fact that many of these buildings could be considered kitsch or the product of cultural misunderstandings, or that they were part of essentially an imperialist agenda, perhaps even that they were foreign? And I think at least the last criticism can be softened, considering that buildings of this style and scale are not really seen outside Sarajevo, including Vienna or Budapest, where such buildings not really exist, certainly not on this scale. They were products of an international architectural discourse, but they were specifically designed for the local attention market. In other words, they would have not worked outside Bosnia. And I also believe that the participation of Muslim opinion leaders in the development of this style in the second half of the 1880s has likely been underestimated, as I discussed in greater detail in my book. Of course, by, let's say, 1910, everyone outraged, the representative of a heavily policed, repressive climate of the color area. But if we look at them now as buildings, they don't really seem to greatly disrupt Sarajevo's genius loci as a place of, let's say, diverse cultural presences, or as the 1997 application to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site put it, as a place of multiculture. This application was not successful so far. Diplomatic euphemism of having it remain on the so-called tentative stage. Perhaps today after a flare-up of World Heritage Sites, the quality of a multicultural history would also not any longer be considered sufficiently exceptional. But what is certainly unique about Sarajevo, I believe, is the way in which buildings from different periods and cultural contexts have been brought into dialogue with each other in certain periods of time. And I think misunderstandings, as we could call this style, were part of this dialogue. At the same time, we could say that some outputs of this experiment were so artistically persuasive that they became really iconic, such as the Sept, which, as many of you know, has been exported as a symbol of Sarajevo's Oriental qualities to places such as Belgrade, but even to Ankara or St. Louis. So perhaps emphasizing historical multiculturalism is not the only way forward. The anthropological concept of transculturation might also be a good fit. We could discuss it. This describes a process of cultural blending in which something actually new is created, as opposed to a variety of cultures and their heritage and their traditions simply coexisting. So, in other words, it describes culturally productive dialogue between the old and the new in this form, in Sarajevo, but regardless of the wording, we probably all agree that the city's uniqueness deserves some kind of international recognition, and the surveyed buildings that I've shown today will certainly be part of this movement. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions or answer a dialogue.